David Carter stood on his front lawn, facing an irate neighbor whose face was flushed with anger. "I'm calling the cops on you," the man shouted, his finger pointing accusingly at David. "You don't belong in this neighborhood." David's heart pounded, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, only to be interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. As the police cruiser pulled up, David straightened his posture, bracing himself for what was to come. The tension in the air was palpable, and David knew this confrontation was far from over. David Carter pulled into the driveway of 72 Willow Street, his sedan laden with moving boxes. His eyes swept over the well-maintained homes and neatly trimmed lawns of his new neighborhood. A mix of excitement and apprehension coursed through him as he stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The colonial house before him represented a hard-earned achievement, but David couldn't shake the awareness that he was likely one of the few black residents in this predominantly white area. As he began unloading boxes, he noticed a slight movement in a nearby window. A face quickly retreated behind a curtain, leaving David with a familiar sense of scrutiny. Determined to make a good impression, David continued his task. He reflected on the demographic research he'd done before moving, knowing that in neighborhoods like this, black residents made up less than 5% of the population. The sound of a door opening caught his attention, and he turned to see an older woman emerge from across the street. David offered a friendly wave, which was returned after a brief hesitation. As the afternoon progressed, David noticed increased activity in the neighboring houses. Hushed conversations drifted across lawns, and curtains twitched with curiosity. He tried to focus on his work, reminding himself that he belonged here regardless of others' opinions. By sunset, David had brought the last box inside. He stood on the porch, surveying the quiet street with a sense of accomplishment. Tomorrow would bring the furniture truck and the true start of his new life. Unbeknownst to David, his arrival had caused a stir next door. As he closed his front door, looking forward to rest, his neighbor Robert Hayes paced in his living room. Robert's face was etched with concern as he peered through his blinds, his gaze fixed on the house that had, until recently, stood empty. The presence of David Carter had disrupted the familiar rhythm of Willow Street, and Robert was determined to take action. The evening quiet on Willow Street was broken by the urgent sound of a phone being dialed. Robert Hayes' voice, tight with anxiety, reached the 911 operator. "There's a suspicious man in my neighbor's house," he blurted out. "I think he might be breaking in. He's been carrying boxes inside all afternoon." The operator's tone remained professional, but a hint of skepticism crept in. "Can you describe this person, sir?" "What exactly makes you think he's suspicious?" Robert hesitated, realizing how flimsy his justification sounded. "Well, he's not from around here. He doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood." "Sir, can you be more specific? What is he wearing? What actions have you observed that seem suspicious?" The operator's questions forced Robert to confront his assumptions. Robert's voice grew defensive. "Look, I know what I'm seeing. This is a safe, quiet neighborhood. We don't get many new people moving in, especially not—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. The operator pressed further, recognizing the potential for bias. "Sir, I understand you're concerned, but we need concrete reasons to dispatch officers. Has this person done anything illegal or threatening?" Robert watched as David calmly carried another box into the house. "No, I guess not. But shouldn't someone at least verify if he's supposed to be here?" The operator sighed, recognizing the deeper issues at play. "Sir, moving into a new home is not a crime. Without evidence of wrongdoing, we can't question someone's right to be in their own neighborhood based on how they look." Despite her words, Robert's fears won out. "Please, just send someone. For the safety of the community," he pleaded. Reluctantly, the operator agreed to dispatch a unit. As Robert hung up, a mix of relief and unease washed over him. He peered out the window, watching as a police cruiser pulled up in front of David's house across the street. David looked up from unpacking a box of kitchen utensils, the flashing lights catching his attention. A familiar weight settled in his stomach. He set down the box, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto his front porch, bracing himself for what was to come. David's fingers tightened around his ID as the officers approached, their faces a mix of caution and curiosity. He stood his ground on the manicured lawn, his posture relaxed but alert. The familiar weight of frustration settled in his chest. "Good evening, sir," the taller officer said, hand resting on his belt. We received a call about suspicious activity. Mind if we ask you a few questions? David nodded, his voice steady. Of course, officers. How can I help you? Can you tell us what you're doing here? The shorter officer asked, eyes narrowed. A weary sigh escaped David's lips. I live here. I just moved in today. The officers exchanged a skeptical glance. Before they could respond, a commotion erupted from next door. Robert Hayes burst out, face flushed with fear and indignation. That's him, officers, he shouted, pointing at David. He doesn't belong here. David felt his frustration building, but took a deep breath, centering himself. Sir, he addressed Robert directly, his voice firm but non-threatening. I understand your concern, but I assure you, I do live here. I'm your new neighbor. Robert scoffed. Prove it then. The officers shifted uncomfortably, caught between duty and growing realization. With deliberate slowness, David reached into his pocket. I'd be happy to, he said, pulling out his wallet and extracting his ID. I think this should clear things up. The taller officer took the ID, his eyes widening as he read it. He looked up at David, then back at the ID, disbelief etched on his face. You're Chief Carter? He stammered. David nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That's right. I'm the new police chief for this district. I start officially next week, but I wanted to get settled in first. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The officers straightened their postures, shifting instantly. Robert's mouth gaped open, his face draining of color. I'm so sorry, Chief, the shorter officer began, voice thick with embarrassment. David held up a hand, his expression softening. It's all right, officers. You were just doing your job. But I hope this serves as a reminder about the dangers of making assumptions. As reality settled over the group, David could see the first glimmers of change in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In that moment, he knew his work in this community was just beginning. The stunned silence that followed David's revelation hung heavy in the air. Neighbors who had gathered to witness the commotion stood frozen, their faces a canvas of conflicting emotions. David took a deep breath, aware that his next words could shape the future of this community. I understand this isn't the introduction any of us expected, David began, his voice steady and calm. He looked around, meeting the eyes of each person in turn. Some gazes dropped, unable to hold his, while others stared back with a mixture of shame and curiosity. David shared a brief, poignant account of his experiences with racial profiling, his words painting a vivid picture of the constant vigilance required to navigate a world that often viewed him with suspicion. As he spoke, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. The initial tension began to give way to something more complex, a dawning realization of their shared humanity. Robert Hayes, the neighbor who had made the call, stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. David could see the internal struggle playing out behind Robert's eyes, the clash between long-held biases and the undeniable reality before him. I'm here to create a community where everyone feels safe and valued, David continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. He outlined his vision for community policing, emphasizing open dialogue and mutual understanding. As he spoke about his plans for community engagement and bias training, reactions varied widely. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions softening, while others shifted uncomfortably. Change isn't easy, David acknowledged, his voice tinged with empathy. But it's necessary, and it starts with each one of us. The silence that followed was charged with potential, the first glimmer of a community on the cusp of transformation. David turned to Robert. Mr. Hayes, he said, extending his hand, I'd like you to be part of the solution. Your perspective is valuable in creating a safer, more inclusive neighborhood for everyone. Robert hesitated, his eyes darting between David's outstretched hand and the expectant faces of his neighbors. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped forward and grasped David's hand. The handshake was brief but firm, a small yet significant step toward understanding. David felt the weight of the moment settling over the community as the crowd dispersed. This incident had the potential to spark real change, but he knew the road ahead would be challenging. The true test would come in the following days and months as they all worked to transform this painful experience into an opportunity for growth and progress. As the dust settled from that fateful evening, Willow Street and its surroundings experienced a quiet transformation. David's appointment as police chief sparked conversations that many had long avoided. Officers grappled with their own biases at the precinct, some embracing change while others resisted. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now buzzed with residents eager to voice their concerns and hopes. David observed these shifts with a mix of pride and caution, each small victory, a neighbor's genuine smile, a decrease in unfounded suspicious person calls, reinforcing his commitment. Yet challenges persisted. Old habits clung stubbornly, and not everyone welcomed the shifting dynamics. David poured himself into community engagement initiatives, fostering dialogue between officers and residents from all backgrounds. Robert Hayes's hesitant acceptance to join a community advisory board marked a tentative step forward. Their conversations, though sometimes tense, proved illuminating for both men. As David sat on his porch one evening, the streetlights flickering to life, he allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He stood up, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, determined to lead by example and build a more just community, one day at a time.